All right, hello and welcome to Unit 5 in our New Mexico history class. In this unit, we will cover the territorial period all the way up through statehood. We'll talk about some of the roadblocks to statehood, the reasons that it took 64 years for that to occur, and we'll also look at the ways in which Nuevo Mexicanos reinvented themselves, at least at the level of the Rico class, although there's some evidence that it filtered down as well, through a notion called the Spanish-American identity myth. We'll also look at debates over bilingual education as the constitutional conventions met in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and what speaking Spanish, how that was seen by people who were only English speakers outside of New Mexico and other parts of the United States. Finally, we'll turn to the achievement of statehood. Then we'll look at the World War I era. The Mexican Revolution threatened New Mexico in certain ways. Pancho Villa raided Columbus, New Mexico, which is an area of research that I've been involved with, and so I've added a reading that I recently published relative to the little town of Columbus and how it was trying to invent itself despite its proximity to Mexico and the Villa raid, and what all happened there. So the bottom line is that despite this struggle for statehood that took so long, Nuevo Mexicanos remained suspect even after statehood arrived. They found it necessary to try to prove themselves time and again through service in various wars. So we'll look at the Civil War, we'll look at the Apache Wars as they were called. We'll also look at the Buffalo Soldiers, the African-American soldiers after Civil War during Reconstruction who became part of the U.S. military and who played a major role in the wars against Native peoples in the Southwest and in the Midwest as well. So we'll look at those people coming into New Mexico during the territorial period. Then another war that Nuevo Mexicanos fought in was the Spanish-Cuban-American War. That's often referred to as the Spanish-American War, but in the e-text I've titled it the Spanish-Cuban-American War because it's often forgotten that this struggle, this conflict, was actually the Cuban independence movement. It was pushing for its independence from Spain beginning in 1895, and then in 1898, for various reasons, the United States got involved, although making the promise that it would not take control outright of Cuba. It kept Cuba essentially as a protectorate, more or less through the Cuban Revolution of 1959, in which Fidel Castro and those joined with him in the July 2026 movement were successful in taking control of the island. So the Cuban relations go way, way back in ways that the way we title certain conflicts tend to erase or at least negate. And I wanted to remind us here that this conflict was a war with Spain, but it was over Cuba's independence. And in the process, Nuevo Mexicanos found themselves in sort of a difficult position. Many of them served with Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. Others served in various other theaters of the war very honorably. Yet their loyalty to the United States always remained suspect in other forums. The idea that they spoke Spanish and English was something that members of Congress derided. We'll read the words of John C. Calhoun from just after 1848, from the early 1850s, extremely racist in terms of his thinking about why Nuevo Mexicanos should not be allowed to have citizenship equal to that of white Americans. And perhaps it shouldn't be too surprising in the context of the United States right around the Civil War, when the question of African American slavery was something that was still being protected by Southerners and being touted as a positive good for American society and for Southern society as well. So New Mexicans were trying to find their place within that context during the territorial period. Along with those racist impulses at work against them, there were notions that New Mexico was too much of a rough and tumble Wild West environment. The Lincoln County War, the Colfax County War that took place before that, the legends of Billy the Kid, all of those things contributed to that sort of notion. And so people in New Mexico are kind of trying to figure out, how do we overcome this? by 1912, as we'll read about, and as I often say, statehood finally came, but it was sort of an anticlimax. Nothing had really changed very much in terms of New Mexico's politics by the turn of the 20th century. That was also another point of concern in Washington. Turn of the 20th century, a guy named Albert Beveridge, who was a senator from Indiana, was pushing back against New Mexico's statehood on the grounds that it was ill-prepared because of its political corruption, also ill-prepared because the people there spoke Spanish, they were more loyal to Mexico than the United States, things that were not necessarily true, or not even true at all, but that he believed to be true and that he used as arguments against New Mexico's statehood. What changed was that he lost a lot of his prominence in the Senate. There were other people who had long supported New Mexico's statehood. So something else to remember is that with all of the kind of racist and anti-statehood voices in Congress, there were always others that were pushing back and saying, no, wait, we need to provide New Mexico a chance to become part of the United States. And that's not always saying that those people are any less racist, but they had different interests. And unfortunately, that's kind of what the story boils down to, and eventually all the interests aligned by 1910. President Taft, signed the Enabling Act. New Mexico became a state. But as we'll read about, and not to be too much of a downer, but a lot of the problems that were facing New Mexico during the territorial period, things like poverty, things like being kind of shunned by the larger economic interests in the United States, still those feelings of racism against Nuevo Mexicanos and indigenous people, those things persisted. Nuevo Mexicanos still tried to prove their loyalty by service in yet another war, well, I should say 2 wars actually, by serving in the punitive expedition that chased Pancho Villa into Mexico, and then also serving in the European theater in World War I. Again, despite all of that, despite the tourism industry coming in, despite kind of reformers and artists coming to New Mexico and seeing it as this place that to them was the most American of anywhere in the nation, most of the movers and shakers in the political arena and even in the social arena didn't see New Mexico in that way. And so this period is, I think, highly interesting because of all these complex contrasts and conflicts, and there are even a few things for this unit that I didn't mention, big important topics like the Long Walk that we'll study in some detail. So I hope you enjoy Unit 5. As always, please let me know if you have any questions along the way.